Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next edition of my COVID special series, where we talk to leaders in business and academics, trying to understand what impact the COVID pandemic is having on businesses. And today, I'm extremely thrilled to get a big visionary leader's perspective on how COVID is transforming the business place. I have the pleasure of introducing an old friend of mine, Mr. Agostino Renna. Our history goes back almost 10, 15 years right now. But Agostino Renna is one of those stars out there who was a very, very young vice president of sales for the EMEA region at a company called Johnson Controls. He's also spent time with GE. So essentially, and then right now he is a VP and general manager for a company called Amcor, which is into packaging. But more specifically, Agostino is a VP and GM of two of the business units, which is actually high performance laminates and capsules. If you want to know more about it, reach out to Agostino. I'm sure he can spend days talking about those things. But what is very interesting is that while we've talked to salespeople and sales managers and academics, we are now talking to an individual who's responsible for €1 billion in sales, close to $1.1 billion in sales, is responsible for making sure that 16 factories are used productively to make things happen and have profitable growth. And at the same time, is responsible for the livelihoods of 3,500 people, and not to mention how many other suppliers that rely on this organization. So it's an absolute pleasure, Agostino, for me to talk to you and also for you to share your thoughts with the audience. And today, specifically, I want to pick your brains, especially as a leader, on how have you approached this pandemic? Because there were a lot of talks about trends happening in the business place. You know, when we began 2020, when we said, great, we're going to get into 2020 with all these ideas and ambitions with these megatrends. Tell me about these megatrends. And in today's interview, which is going to be part one, because we won't have time to discuss all, I want to discuss a couple of them in detail with you on that one. So tell me a little bit more about some of the trends that you saw going into 2020.
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. It really is nice to reconnect with you and to have an opportunity to share my thoughts. I guess my usual disclaimer, and I used to say this when you and I used to work together in a previous life. I'm the furthest thing from being, an academic in any way, shape, or form. I'm the child of blue-collar immigrants that got an engineering degree and then learned how to do business on the fly. So I want to apply that disclaimer because everything I'm going to say is a perspective. It doesn't necessarily make it true, false, or indifferent. It's just my perspective as I observe kind of the business that I'm responsible for. So from a micro perspective, Deva, what we're focused on right now, obviously, like many other companies, is kind of three important priorities, and then I'll zoom out and hit the megatrends. Okay, but in the short term and in the immediate term, job one for us is keeping all of our coworkers safe. Okay, there is no business continuity to the extent that we can't provide a safe work environment for our employees and protect them against this virus. So keeping our coworkers safe is job one. Secondly, is maintaining the continuity of our operations. For those of you that know a little bit about our company, we operate in the primary packaging space. And so everything that we do generally is related to either food and or medicine in some way, shape, or form. So the work that we do right now has never been more important. And so maintaining the continuity of our operations is critically important. And then the third in this time is for us to give back and to support the communities where we live and work. So we're actively, there are some instances where we're donating product, in some instances we're making financial donations to a variety of different charities. But those three things have guided kind of our actions throughout the pandemic. Okay, so that's sort of short term here and now. Okay.
And I think that one of the things which I also want to touch upon is that I like the idea of continuity of your business operations, because it's such a broad thing. For you, it's minor, but the fact is that there are 3,500 families that are at stake in terms of the fact that being able to put bread on the table for them, not to mention your customers who are waiting because of all these kind of things. So essentially, it's much more, it's a minor thing for you, but it has such big ramifications for so many people, including your employees, their families, your suppliers, their employees, their families, and not to mention people like me who actually go into the grocery stores during these difficult times and making sure that there's continuity, or go into the pharmacies and actually have this. And I think it's amazing that, yes, you're doing all the other things, but I think that's amazing that you're
Yes.
working this. And of course, the other two things tie into it, right? The idea is
It's
that keep
been
an employee safe.
Yeah, it's been for sure a very galvanizing experience for our company, to wake up every day feeling like, on the one hand, you have an obligation to keep people safe within your own perimeter, but secondly, you have an obligation to make sure that the products that we package make their way onto the shelves so that people can
Yeah.
consume them at a time where most everything is constrained. So
Yeah.
anyways, that's sort of the quick
Yeah.
synopsis of COVID and how we're organizing around COVID. If I zoom out and get to the topic of our discussion, when you and I chatted about this, we talked about, in my view, I always tell people there's kind of four big mega trends that I think, regardless of what business you are in and what part of the world you are in, it's highly likely that these four things act in some way, shape, or form as a force on your business or whatever mission it is you're trying to accomplish. Okay, so what I thought I would do is we can quickly just blast through the four and then come in and zoom in on the first, and we'll see if we can get to the second.
Yes.
And I'll provide some perspective, sort of pre-crisis and post-crisis, on how I think those things potentially change. So mega trend number one, in my view, is just this notion of extreme globalization. Okay, so we can park that, and I'll get back to it, and we'll zoom in on that one here in a second. So this notion of connected everything across borders, across geographies, but over the last 20, 25 years, I think from an economic perspective, we've made significant inroads in terms of making the world a much smaller place and uniting the best and brightest from a brain trust perspective, as well as manufacturing and supply chains, so that the world has become a lot smaller. So this notion of extreme globalization, I think, is a force that acts on any business in the world. First. Second, I always talk about the mega trend of sustainability. Okay, and for me, this one is simple. If you actually go back and just take a broad perspective, there's really two things that are making the notion of sustainability critically important for us as a human species. The first is that the population on the planet is steadily increasing. Okay, so if you project forward, there are demographic studies that show that two countries that are India and China, are going to surpass 2.5 billion people very shortly, if they haven't already. It wasn't so long ago that the entire planet had 2.5 billion people. In fact, it was in the 1950s. Okay, so increased population on the planet combined with this aspiration to have a wealthier and wealthier lifestyle. Now, the notion of wealth gets contextualized based on where you live in the world. So if you're in an emerging economy, it might need access to things like electricity, clean water, different types of basic necessities. If you're in a developed economy, it means more iPhones, more cars, more things, right? But generally, when you combine those two, and you have increasing population with an aspiration to do more things, it puts a huge strain on a finite set of resources in the world. Okay, so this notion of sustainability is critical for survival. So that's the second. The third, Internet of Things, right? Everyone talks about this. It's the biggest buzzword in the world. To me, it's the coming together of the physical and the digital worlds in a way that drives some level of productivity or enhanced convenience. Okay, so the Internet of Things, I think, is probably the biggest productivity platform that we have seen since the Industrial Revolution. Okay? And then fourth, but not least, and people laugh when I call this one out as a global megatrend, is the proliferation of social media. Okay? Now, for those of you out there that think that social media is just this thing where you post pictures of what you ate for breakfast and fun things that your family is doing, yes, it is all of that. But I would argue that never in our existence have we had the ability to have instantaneous conversation with thousands, maybe even millions of people at the click of a button in real time. And so when you think about what that potentially can bring to us in terms of things like idea prototyping, crowdsourcing, crowdfunding. There's just a space there that is
Indeed.
incredibly ripe for disruption and change. Okay, so those are the four at a helicopter level: extreme globalization, my terminology, sustainability, Internet of Things, and then social media as a trend. So let me go back into globalization for a second, and then we can have a quick dialogue on that one.
But just before you do that, Agostino,
yeah, go ahead.
That's interesting. So you talk about these four things, right? And this is what you had in mind beginning 2020, right? I mean, not that it's not that you didn't think about it before, but let's say, for example, as a business leader, you're taking a look at the year coming up ahead. So essentially, you're looking at these four megatrends and asking yourself, what kind of decisions as a leader should I be making to take my team on this journey? Because it's just not your team, right? Because it has implications for your customers downstream. It has implications for your suppliers upstream. So essentially, as a leader, these are the four things that you're planning to tackle, that at least you plan to tackle at the beginning of 2020. Correct?
Absolutely. I would say it more bluntly, is that regardless of what business you're in, if your strategic plans and your operating plans don't have in them a representation in some way, shape, or form of what your response is to the trend of globalization, the trend of sustainability, the trend of Internet of Things, and the power of social media as it relates to its ability to shape opinion and to either create value or destroy value of brands. Okay? If you're not thinking about those things, and I don't care if you're in the funeral home business, packaging, jet engines, those four things will affect you in some way, shape, or form.
Indeed.
Okay.
Indeed. Absolutely.
So, you know, then we go to globalization, and it's interesting. You know, when we thought of globalization before COVID-19, what we kept thinking about was how the world has become more and more small. People, businesses, I would even argue that environmental ecosystems connected globally in ways that we never envisioned 20, 25 years ago. Okay. And businesses have taken advantage of that, right? Open borders, the ability to source product at relatively high quality from any country in the world. And so what it's created is a dynamic in the world where you have best of breed producers, manufacturers, service providers that you can basically gain access to if you know where they are and if you're intelligent enough to activate them and negotiate with them. Okay? From a people perspective, this global pandemic has physically demonstrated how connected we are physically amongst people. Think about how quickly this has spread.
Indeed.
Okay? So there's no better proof of how physically connected we are as a human species. Just take a look at how quickly this pandemic has spread.
Absolutely. And I think that is what is amazing, right? Because the previous financial crisis was more about the connection of the financial systems. It was not about people, right? And this is literally, this pandemic has even taken that to the next level in terms of saying, if people are not traveling across boundaries, and I'm sure you're going to touch upon other aspects that's got to do with nationalistic intentions coming up because of these kind of wanting to protect the people against this.
Absolutely.
And I think that's very, very interesting.
So you're correct. That's the ripple effect of this, and I'll get to that in a second. So people, you know, the connection, physical connection of people is on display by virtue of how quickly this thing has proliferated. Then you talk about businesses, and, you know, a company like ours, global supply chain, global factories, mobile employees. We have employees that fly all over the place to do all kinds of things and get in front of customers in all parts of the world, etc. So basically, and generally, the unrestricted movement of people and goods pretty much from anywhere to anywhere in the world. That was pre-COVID, okay? Pre-COVID. And it created for businesses a fantastic opportunity. You know, years ago, it was this notion of labor arbitrage. So companies had got really good at chasing wages in terms of positioning their factories in places where wages were lower. I would argue that in today's environment, and given the fact that we've, to a large extent, started to lean on things like robotics and control systems and what have you, if you look at our own factories, for example, the labor component of what we do progressively has gotten smaller over time, okay? Because we've become technology enabled. But pre-COVID, this notion of globalization was very prevalent, and many companies had strategies designed to be able to take advantage of the fact that the world is a small place and you can draw from best of breed in any country that you might want. Okay? Now, then comes COVID. Okay? Then comes COVID. And interestingly enough, in a perverse sort of way, you could argue that the world is becoming more globalized as it relates to the connection of people. Okay? Now, it isn't physical connection.
Yeah.
It isn't physical connection. But I can tell you as a personal example, I have been more in front of my team here throughout this crisis by design, right? Because as a leader, you want to lead from the front at a time of crisis. But I can tell you that we've probably been more connected during this time of crisis than less connected. Okay, and I think by virtue of technology and what that enables.
Yeah.
So what this brings then is the hypothesis that it'll redefine how people build and nurture relationships. Okay, I think is the first kind of adjacency that comes from COVID-19. If you double click on that, Deva, and you think about what that means in the sales domain, right? Where generally, I grew up as a sales guy, right? This is my passion, and
that's why we met. Huh?
Yes, exactly. And you essentially get up every day trying to build and nurture relationships with a purpose. Okay. And in the old days, the way you did that is you did it by phone, you did it by face-to-face meetings, you occasionally had a dinner, a lunch, but you kind of created that connection by being in physical proximity of the customer that you were trying to serve. Coming out the other end of COVID, I think that how we build and nurture relationships will be different.
Yeah.
I think that it'll be acceptable to do what you're doing. We're at opposite ends of the world right now, right? I mean, you're sitting in Indiana and I'm sitting in Zurich, Switzerland.
Absolutely.
And here we are having a real-time conversation.
Absolutely.
So post-COVID, I think the way people build and nurture relationships in the context of this globalization trend will be different. Okay.
Indeed.
Second, supply chains will be challenged as the free movement of goods becomes challenged and constrained. Okay? And we're already seeing that. As well, the importance of business continuity plans that give companies optionality will become priority one. So if you're a business where you have a single supplier of a thing that is located in China or India, and you manufacture in the United States or you manufacture in Germany or Switzerland, in this environment, that's a bad strategy. It's a bad strategy because at any point in time, you can have, either by virtue of this pandemic or by virtue of government intervention, you can have that entire value chain seize up and all of a sudden you can't supply your customers.
Indeed.
So the second offshoot under the banner of globalization related to COVID is going to be the importance of really pressure testing your supply chain and designing it for optionality. Meaning if I can't get from A, I have B and C lined up and able to provide.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So big important point. The corollary of what I just said is that I do think there's going to be a push towards localization. Okay? Which is the opposite of globalization. If
Absolutely,
you think about it.
Indeed.
And so what that means is a lot of different things for a lot of different people. There'll be puts and takes in all of this, meaning some businesses will benefit from a localization trend. Some businesses will be hurt by a localization trend. Generally, I would think that big multinational companies will be able to navigate a little bit more.
Interesting. Absolutely. I think that's an interesting point. Sorry for interrupting, but I think that's a very, very interesting point, because people would think that multinationals are so rigid in the way they work. But what we fail to understand is that when you said you're there in 16 countries, right? 16 locations, 16 locations. And the idea is that you're also ideally located. Yes, it's your supply chains are linked. Maybe in some of them you're dependent on parts coming in from other parts of or your own factories. But it could also mean that you could start sourcing locally, but you could be in a position where you can tell some of your customers saying, we can serve you both locally, but if you want, we can also serve you from our individual plants. So you actually have the capabilities to be flexible, assuming that you have an open mindset
Yep.
and you think along these lines. I think it's absolutely fascinating because, quite contrary to what you might think, that you might be too heavy as a multinational,
Yep.
could be that this could maybe one help you open more doors with customers who might have looked at you as plan C.
Yes.
And now suddenly, wait a minute, they say, wait a minute, but you have a factory just down the street. So essentially, I could also rely on you because my supplier is smaller. They don't have access to resources, but you could.
Correct.
And I think that's very fascinating from that viewpoint.
Yeah, and look, I think that despite anything related to COVID-19 and the pandemic, um, we've always tried to be both global and local at the same time. And being global gives you scale, and with scale comes certain gifts, advantages. Being local gives you intimacy, and intimacy gives you other advantages. So I think to me, it's about striking the right balance. However, the point I'm trying to make here is that where over the last 20, 25 years, the pendulum shifted very significantly in the direction of globalization, global supply chains, and global kind of fulfillment models. I do think that the learning from COVID-19 will be a force in the direction of localization. Okay? Which leads me to my next point. If you think about what these global economies are going through on the back of this crisis, essentially, you're going to have all kinds of different, call them stimulus packages, rescue packages, whatever words you want to use for this, but it'll be an injection of capital into the various economies around the world. That capital or that money at some point will need to be recovered. Okay, and so you're really left with two avenues. One is you tax your citizens, knowing that your citizens are already significantly strained because job losses, unemployment, etc. Or you start to think about different types of legislative instruments like tariffs, import and export, and a variety of other things that you could put in place that frankly make it a little more difficult for global competition to operate. Okay, and so it will be another, I think, offshoot of this crisis will be government intervention, and how that government intervention potentially, I don't want to use the word distorts because it's sort of it's a little bit of a negative term, but how that government intervention will reshape the global trading dynamics by virtue of the fact that you're going to have, whether we like it or not, designs of protectionism for economies that are trying to be propped up where these stimulus funds need to be recovered. So that, if I say it maybe as a summary, as I step back and think about this trend of globalization coming out of COVID, more people, more digitally connected would be kind of summary point number one. Supply chains thirsty for optionality, I would say is the second. Push towards localization, okay, for better or worse, because I think there's pros and cons to pushing towards localization. Government intervention in some way, shape, or form. And I think all of these things are going to affect the notion of globalization as we know it. Indeed. So let me pause there, and now I'll get your reactions.
Essentially, what I'm thinking of is that, see, from a leader's perspective, this is what you're looking at. I'm also looking from the viewpoint of salespeople, and here is what my take on every one of your point is. And you can tell me where I'm right or what you would like to add to that as well. The first one is the relationships are becoming more global because of digital age, and I think it has implications in both how you become more closer to your customers because of this. But I really think you hit something on the head, which I think sales leaders need to understand. Now is the time for you to become more accessible to your salespeople. And the interesting thing is going to be is this COVID, unintentionally, are you going to become closer to your salespeople? The good sales managers are going to become leaders, are going to become closer to the salespeople. And I really think it is going to help in the following two things that you said. That is, the more closer I become to my salespeople, it's actually going to force your sales managers and your sales leaders again to go back and not just think about bigger issues, but we have to deal with the kind of issues like the supply chain optimization, because now, because it's your salespeople on the field who are going to be asked these questions. It's going to force you to have, and because of digital, because you're getting closer to your salespeople, as leaders, the benefit that you're going to have is, I am going to hear this problem coming from India, but wait a minute, I'm getting the same kind of issues coming from elsewhere. So what you're going to benefit from is a fact is that why should we come up with two different options and reinvent the wheel everywhere? This is a great opportunity for you to actually bring minds together, and you're globally connected because of digital. I think that's one of the things which I think is very interesting from that perspective.
You know, you and I used to co-teach a course on solution selling or value selling, whatever we used to call it. There has never been more fertile ground than now.
Indeed.
For the notion of being a true solution provider to a customer.
Absolutely.
Look, I see it pretty much every day. Our customers are struggling right now with some really complicated problems,
Indeed.
And so what they don't need from their sales professional right now is someone that's going to come in with the traditional brochure and say, how many of these do you want? How many of those do you want?
Indeed.
What they need is a sales professional that's going to help them look around corners, anticipate things that might be coming, and give them good advice for the types of decisions they should make and the types of things they should buy.
Absolutely.
And that part of the value spectrum for salespeople over time has eroded, Deva. And the reason it's eroded is because there's so much information available out in the internet. I mean, you could Google any product, and as a customer or as a potential customer, you'll quickly become an expert on the thing that you want to buy.
Indeed.
Okay? So when I started selling, part of how I became valuable to a customer was to make them smart on the thing they were trying to buy.
Absolutely.
Okay? When we engage now as sales professionals, that customer is already pretty smart on the thing they want to buy.
Indeed.
Now this crisis creates an opportunity to again enhance that value spectrum because the field of play has become so complex that if you as a salesperson have the ability to emerge as a problem solver, you'll win more than you lose.
Absolutely. And I think that is what I think is brilliantly, as you put it, because what and where can I create value as a salesperson in today's economically challenging times, that actually your points 2 and 3 is I am going to create value, not because of a fantastic product, but actually because of my complete solution. That could mean access to maybe capital, access to extra capacity, or help work together with you to solve those problems where, hey, yes, you've always looked at me as option 3 or option 4. You prefer to work with your suppliers, but now in the interest of continuity, give us a chance. So it gives you the opportunity to go in to those players or customers you've never worked with before, but you can only get in if you're bringing in value for a problem that their current supplier is not able to handle.
Correct. You know, there's been some specific examples throughout this crisis where one of our customers, you know, usually a small or mid-sized company, has trouble sourcing a particular raw material, right? And there's been instances where because of our size and how we buy and where we buy, you know, we've been less constrained in terms of those material flows. And so in some instances, we've actually helped those customers procure their own raw materials through our own procurement organization. And that's been facilitated by our salespeople. So think about that value, right? If you're a customer that doesn't know how they're going to source their raw material to make their product, and you all of a sudden emerge as the person that has the answer to that question, you've become incredibly valuable to that customer.
Absolutely. And for me, that's what I said, because you combine that with the fact that now they're afraid that reliance on one single supplier is not going to help them. They're looking for other suppliers.
Correct.
But when they're looking for other suppliers, you have to still stand out amongst the other suppliers. And this is your one way. And guess what? Salespeople whose managers and leaders are connected through digital means, where you have more frequent meetings, you're going to have more frequent flow of communication, which means that it's not going to take 3 weeks before Agostino hears about it.
Yep.
Here is something you hear about it much faster because you're having these weekly periodic meetings just to keep the spirits of your team up high.
Yep.
And suddenly you hear ideas, boom, you can actually help. That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah.
And the last one, which I think is very, very interesting, is that government intervention and tariffs and stuff like that. that is going to ask salespeople to come up with creative solutions, not just salespeople, with their own organization, right? How are we going to try to do this? How can we work with local players and local suppliers to make sure that at least for the local factories, we can escape when I mean escape, I'm saying that how can we work with the local suppliers, your own suppliers? How can we source better in the interest of what we can help our customers with? And is actually going to make your salespeople broaden their network. And I really like what you said is that we are actually maybe going back to the salespeople pre-internet.
Yes.
Except that now there is internet, but now what I'm saying is I'm going to use that internet to build connections because of what I know where I am going to, and then come up with more useful solutions to my customer, which is what I really think is the salesperson moving forward, is they have to become more of these connected people,
Yes.
which is what I really like, because we'll come back to it later on when we talk about social media, is how can I use social media to build those connections, both as an organization, but with me as an individual, how can I become seen as a person, as a thought leader, so that if I have a problem, I go to that salesperson and he or she can help us, he, she, or they can help us with solving these issues, because they are connected internally within they're connected to
Yes.
all the way up to Agostino, but they're also connected to the local other suppliers, and I can make it happen. And that's very interesting. We are again, are we going back to the salespeople of the old, where maybe we need to go for generalization to a certain extent rather than too much specialization again, because that is the need of the hour now. Huh?
Yeah, look, I think all of those points are extremely valid. And, the other thing I'll say, which has been a learning for me and all of my team throughout this crisis, is that in this environment, whether you're a salesperson or anyone else in the organization, speed matters.
Yes.
And what I mean by that is that a decision that is 80% right taken quickly is much better than a decision that's 100% right taken slowly. Okay, so we have to resist the urge to solve for perfection, because to me, this environment is more an environment of rapid iteration than it is, sort of one shot, one kill. It's not one of those. Absolutely. So I would encourage all of us to be creative in our approaches, to be genuine in our intent, because that's really important. Is if nothing else, I think that this crisis has really normalized everyone in the world. It doesn't matter where you live, doesn't matter what your paycheck is like. If this thing hits you, it can kill you, and it doesn't care what color you are, where you live in the world. So there's been a normalization from that perspective. And I actually think that there's an open spirit right now, generally speaking, where if your intent is genuine, you will be able to gain access to the things that you want to gain access to. But your intent needs to be genuine.
Absolutely. And I think that's what I really think is what, as an individual and as an organization, if Correct. You can have it at that level, I think you are going to be successful as well. Agostino, I think in the interest of time, we will stop at this point, but we are going to come back and revisit the other things of sustainability, which is also a very, very interesting topic, the Internet of Things, and then we'll talk about the proliferation of social media, and then kind of close it up with saying how all of them are actually interconnected too, right?
Yes.
The fact is that it's not that, yes, they are megatrends, but there's some sort of connectivity between them as well. And I want to actually pick your brains on that as well. So, so for the audience again, Agostino, thanks for the first episode of what is probably promising to be a very interesting conversation.
That was a lot of fun. I had a blast. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thanks. And then for the audience, stay tuned. We're going to have more of Agostino Renna. He's also much more pleasing to look at than I am. So essentially, stay tuned and you'll actually see much more of these as well. Thank you all.